Opening the center so boldly immediately creates dynamic possibilities and prepares development. Instantaneously mirroring the central pawn advance establishes immediate king's pawn game symmetry and contests the vital square. Developing a knight here immediately attacks the central pawn, forcing black to defend it and setting up a classical struggle for board control. Developing a knight to its most natural square fortifies the central pawn and prepares for kingside castling, a solid opening choice. Instantly establishing a positional pin, white challenges black's knight and hints at future pawn advances on the queen side. Challenging the bishop's presence, this pawn advance forces a decision, potentially creating weaknesses in black's pawn structure later. Retreating the bishop maintains the pin on the knight, keeping pressure on black's queenside pawn structure while preserving flexibility for future development. A bold counterthrust, this knight ignites the center and eyes the weakened d4 square. Securing the monarch proactively, anticipating central skirmishes and future defensive needs. Black prepares to castle, solidifying the king's safety while subtly challenging white's control of the central light squares. Preparing to push the e-pawn forward to challenge black's central presence, while simultaneously reinforcing the kingside defense. Demanding space, black boldly pushes the queenside pawns, a sharp challenge to white's bishop. Re-establishing pressure on the long diagonal after black's pawn push, maintaining options for a future d4 advance. Solidifying the pawn center and preparing for piece development opens up possibilities. Solidifying the center and preparing for a queenside pawn advance or a central break creates a robust pawn structure. Securing the monarch's safety is paramount, allowing for future queenside expansion and preparation for central pawn pushes. A prophylactic maneuver, safeguarding the king's escape square and preventing any immediate bishop intrusion on g4. Developing the bishop to this square prepares for potential queenside counterplay and reinforces the central pawn chain. Challenging the center immediately, this move aims to break open lines and activate pieces. Recapturing central space and bolstering the e-file's defense, preparing for potential pawn pushes. Developing the knight to a more central square facilitates future queenside pressure and supports the central pawn chain. Reclaiming the dark square bishop from its defensive post allows it to survey the queenside, potentially unblocking the c-file later on. A subtle repositioning, aiming to protect the king and prepare for potential central pawn advances while keeping the bishop on a more active diagonal. A curious knight repositioning, aiming to potentially join the queenside pawn storm or support a d5 break later. Probing the queenside flank, this advance aims to disrupt black's defensive pawn chain and potentially open lines for attack. Reactivating the knight to d7 prepares a potential c5 advance, reinforcing black's central pawn structure and improving the bishop's diagonal influence. Consolidating the bishop's influence on the queen side, this move repositions it for a potential kingside assault later. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, 14. c6 aims to reinforce the b5 pawn and prepare for potential queenside expansion, while also restricting white's advanced bishop on c2. Initiating a knight maneuver towards the kingside, aiming to bolster the attacking potential and possibly prepare for a central pawn push. Breaking open the center with this pawn thrust immediately challenges white's central control, aiming to create dynamic play. Centralizing the knight and simplifying the position is a key objective here, aiming to alleviate pawn pressure. Recapturing with the knight immediately challenges white's central pawn thrust, aiming to disrupt their attacking setup and reclaim crucial space. Unlocking the d-file and centralizing the knight, this exchange immediately sharpens the position, inviting tactical exchanges and demanding careful calculation. Reclaiming the pawn opens up the center, potentially activating your pieces and challenging white's central control. Liberating the e4 square for white's knight now creates significant pressure on black's pinned pieces. Unleashing the queen prematurely into this centralized fray invites immediate piece exchanges, potentially simplifying white's attack and creating an awkward queen placement. Reclaiming the d-file with the rook injects immediate activity, setting up potential battery formations against black's queen and disrupting any lingering development plans. Recapturing the knight immediately after the exchange simplifies the position, paving the way for potential piece activity and central pawn breakthroughs. Re-establishing the knight's central influence aims to prepare for queenside expansion and put pressure on black's pawn structure. Knight's jump to the center promises active squares, eyeing the e4 pawn and potentially threatening isolated pieces. Opening this file offers a chance to activate your rook and challenge black's pawn structure, creating immediate dynamic play. Targeting the pinned knight on c3, this maneuver creates immediate tactical complications and aims to disrupt white's queenside structure. Prying open the center, this exchange aims to disrupt black's knight coordination while preparing for potential queenside advances. Lured by the isolated knight, you've sacrificed tempo and piece harmony for a pawn that will soon be trapped. Liberating the c-pawn finally creates a direct threat against black's isolated rook. Reclaiming the sacrificed pawn is the immediate objective, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure. Unleashing the bishop's diagonal presence, this move aims to challenge black's centralized knight and potentially open lines for white's rooks. Dislodging the bishop opens diagonals, aiming to untangle pieces and potentially exploit the queenside weaknesses. Reclaiming the sacrificed exchange, white streamlines the pawn structure and targets the weakened queenside. Reclaiming the knight's lost position, black solidifies their pawn structure and aims to reactivate their dormant pieces from this new anchor point. Reclaiming the initiative, this knight repositions to attack weaknesses in black's shattered pawn structure. Reclaiming the pawn secures material equality, but concedes the open c-file to your opponent's rook. Reinforcing the knight's central post opens up possibilities for pawn breakthroughs. A defensive pawn push, addressing the exposed king and preparing to mobilize troops. Sharpening the knight's scope, this maneuver aims to redeploy the cavalry toward the queenside and pressure black's pawn structure. Contesting the open, a file becomes paramount. Otherwise, the rook's advanced position could become a problem. Recapturing the pawn solidifies control over the d-file, a vital open highway for the rook. This counterattack seizes the open file, disrupting white's intended queenside march with the rook. Securing the king amidst the pawn storm, a pragmatic step prioritizing safety over immediate territorial gains. Reasserting central presence with the knight, this move seeks to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and potentially activate the knight for further action. Relocating the king to a safer square opens avenues for further piece activity and prepares for potential pawn advances. Restoring king safety after the turbulent pawn exchange allows development to continue, albeit from a somewhat constricted position. Asserting pressure on the queenside ranks, the rook awakens, threatening to infiltrate black's weakened position. Solidifying the pawn structure on the kingside is a crucial defensive measure against white's encroaching rooks. Securing the king initiates a strategic regrouping, preparing to contest the open files. Seeking active play, this knight ventures deep, a bold outpost threatening disruption. Shifting the king towards the queenside offers a safer haven and prepares for potential pawn advances. The knight repositions to a more active square, potentially eyeing the central light squares and supporting further pawn advances. The knight decisively stakes its claim on the central outpost, restricting black's pawn structure and offering support for a potential breakthrough. Reclaiming the open file with the rook, black reestablishes defensive pressure and prepares for future counterplay. A tactical skirmish for that central pawn now allows white to open a potent diagonal toward black's vulnerable monarch. Repositioning the rook offers a bit more defensive coverage and prepares to support the king if needed. Reactivating the knight to a central outpost offers both defensive solidity and attacking potential. Activating the bishop to g7 aims for active piece play and potential counterplay along the long diagonal as the game simplifies. Pressuring the pinned knight offers immediate tactical threats and aims to expose black's king. Relocating the rook to the center aims to activate it and contest the d-file, potentially disrupting white's pawn structure. Initiating a pincer on black's queen side, this rook maneuver seeks to exploit the exposed king and isolated pawns. Reactivating the knight to its central square offers active piece play. Exploiting the vulnerable knight, this aggressive capture opens the file and immediately pressures black's pawn structure. Recapturing the pawn opens the f-file, creating immediate pressure on white's king. Challenging black's pawn structure, this rook maneuver aims to disrupt defensive coordination and exploit the open files.